There are stories that pass like whispers in the wind, here today, gone tomorrow. And then there are stories that strike like thunder, shaking the ground beneath our feet. My brothers, my sisters, what you are about to hear is not just another headline. It is not just another piece of Burkina Faso news. It is a story about a people who stood in the dust, coughed in the smoke, and yet chose to breathe again. In the summer of 2025, while the world chased comfort wrapped in plastic, a small West African nation said with a voice firm and unbroken, "Enough. No more poisoning the land, no more choking the children, no more trading tomorrow for a cheap convenience today." And when that decree was signed, the earth itself seemed to sigh with relief. This is not the tale of politicians pleasing donors, nor of leaders bowing for applause. This is the testimony of a people reclaiming dignity, even at great cost. So, I invite you, family, lean in close, listen with your spirit, and subscribe now to walk with us on this journey toward an Africa-clean future. Because this is not only their story, this is our inheritance. There are nations born in marble halls, crowned with wealth, polished by foreign schools. But Burkina Faso was born in dust, dust that clings to your tongue when you speak, dust that coats your feet when you walk, dust that settles deep into your lungs when the smoke of burning plastic rises at dawn. Out of this dust came a man who would one day lift his nation into the light, Ibrahim Traoré. He was not raised in a palace. He did not dine beneath chandeliers. His childhood was the marketplace, where black smoke rolled like a ceiling above the people. His toys were not golden trinkets, but scraps of cloth and empty tins. Yet in that humble beginning, God planted something mighty: resilience. For when a boy grows up breathing poison, he learns to treasure every clean breath as though it were a prayer. And so, when that boy became a man, when he rose not through politics but through struggle, he carried with him a broom instead of a scepter. He swept through markets. He walked barefoot through the alleys. He bent low beside sanitation workers scraping plastic from clogged sewers. And he asked a question no leader before him had dared. Why have we been taught to live like this? Why have we accepted death in exchange for convenience? Then came the day, July of 2025. The decree was signed, not a partial ban, not a promise for the future, but a sudden, uncompromising act. All non-biodegradable plastic bags and wrappings were forbidden. The ink had not yet dried when silence fell across the land. More than 200 factories went dark. Machines that had hummed for decades ceased their song. 10,000 jobs vanished before the sun could set. Fathers walked home with empty hands. Mothers stared at their children's lunch bowls, asking, "How will we feed them now?" Grandmothers in the market clutched roasted corn, unable to wrap it, whispering, "What now, Lord?" The news spread like wildfire. Radios buzzed with disbelief. Markets trembled with fear. Some cried betrayal. Others accused the president of cruelty. And in living rooms and street corners, the question echoed, had their leader stolen bread from their mouths just to clear the sky? Yet at that same moment, something else disappeared. The acrid stench that had hung in Ouagadougou for a generation lifted. The air, once thick with smoke, smelled of rain again. The horizon, once blurred by haze, opened wide like the lungs of a nation inhaling for the first time in decades. Children coughed less that day, and the sky whispered what the people had not dared to hope: freedom. But freedom always comes with a price. Every revolution extracts its due. Traoré knew this. His advisors warned him. International analysts predicted collapse. Even allies trembled at the audacity. But the president looked back to the dust of his childhood and declared, "We cannot afford cheap things that cost us our lives." It was a stand not for applause, but for survival. Not for donors, but for dignity. Not for comfort, but for a future that children could breathe. And so, the world turned its gaze toward this small, landlocked nation. A nation long written off as a receiver of aid, a beggar at the table of global powers. Yet now it stood defiant, saying to the earth itself, "We will not wrap our dignity in poison any longer." My friends, that day marked not just a ban, but a rebirth. Burkina Faso had drawn a line in the sand, a line between death and life, between dependence and defiance, between choking and breathing. But the story does not end here. For while the skies began to clear, the hearts of the people filled with fear. How would they survive without the plastic they had relied on for generations? How would the poor adapt when their daily bread was wrapped in nothing but uncertainty? Stay with me now, because what came next would test not only their economy, but their very spirit. The decree had been signed, the factories had gone silent, and the people stood in shock. For in one hand, they held the promise of clean skies. In the other, they held the bitter taste of hunger. And in the space between, fear began to grow. Among those caught in this storm was Fanta, a woman whose laughter had warmed the corners of Ouagadougou for nearly 3 decades. She had sold roasted corn on the same street corner for 28 years, her voice as rich as the smoke rising from her embers. Every cob of corn she handed to a neighbor was wrapped in a thin blue plastic bag. For her, those bags were not symbols of pollution. They were survival, as familiar as the call to prayer at dawn. But the morning after the ban, 2 policemen approached her stall, their uniforms neat, their tone respectful, but their words struck like thunder. "Madame, plastic is no longer allowed." Fanta froze. In her trembling hands lay the last bundle of plastic bags she had saved. She looked at the officers, then at the faces of her waiting customers. Finally, she whispered, "Then tell me, what do I feed them with now? My fingers?" There was no answer. For 30 years, no one had answered her. And across the nation, that same silence fell heavy. Shopkeepers shuttered their stalls. Factory workers, men who had labored the same machines for decades, stood outside locked gates holding lunch tins that would never see another shift. Mothers wept, unsure how to pack food for their children without the plastic they had relied upon for generations. The anger rose like a tide. "He has taken bread from our mouths just to clear the sky," one worker cried. On the radios, voices accused the president of cruelty. In the markets, some cursed his name. The decree had stripped away not just jobs, but certainty. And yet, in the shadow of that despair, a seed began to sprout. At Fanta's corner, a group of university students appeared. Their arms were filled not with plastic, but with palm leaves, strips of banana fiber, and cloth cut from old garments. They sat with her on the dusty ground and showed her how to fold and tie corn as her grandmothers once did. "We do not want you to stop feeding people," one young man said gently. "We just want to help you do it differently." For the first time in days, Fanta smiled. Her hands, still shaking, folded the first leaf around the golden cob. She tied it with a fiber string. "It feels alive," she whispered. That afternoon, she sold out of corn, not wrapped in plastic, but in the past reborn as hope. This small act lit sparks across the country. Women's cooperatives began weaving baskets from straw. Young men experimented with biodegradable pulp. And deep in a dusty warehouse in Wahiguya, a young engineer named Yakuba refused to mourn what had been lost. His father had once mopped the floors of a French-owned plastic factory, the smell of chemicals haunting their home. But Yakuba, with grease on his hands and fire in his eyes, declared, "We cannot mourn what poisoned us. We must build what heals us." With classmates at his side, he scavenged scrap metal, bamboo frames, and broken pistons to build a crude machine. Night after night, they pressed cassava fiber into flimsy sheets. The first bags tore under a tomato's weight. The second batch melted in the rain. But they refused to surrender. And then, one evening, the machine produced a bag that held, endured, and decomposed in 30 days, leaving nothing but earth behind. Factories had closed, but Yakuba's workshop opened. Soon, laid-off workers joined his team. Women stitched reusable cloth sacks. Farmers sold cassava not just for food, but as raw material for a new green industry. What had been ashes was now a flame. International observers, once doubtful, began to take note. Headlines that had long painted Burkina Faso as a fragile nation now carried a new refrain: innovation, resilience, defiance. But let me pause here, my family. For in every great struggle, there is a moment when despair and hope collide, when the people must decide whether to cling to the old or step boldly into the new. Burkina Faso had reached that crossroad. Would the people remain chained to plastic, or would they rise to craft something their children could touch without fear? Stay with me, because the answer was written not in speeches, but in the hands of a child who once lived in a dump. Before he was called a student, before he was called a worker, before anyone knew him as a son of promise, they called him something else: the boy who lived in the dump. His name was Madu. At 9 years old, he lost his mother to asthma in a thin roof shack, less than 100 meters from a landfill outside Fongora. The landfill was not his enemy. It was his lifeline. Day after day, he crawled through mountains of discarded plastic, scavenging for the thick black bags that sold for a few coins. Blue ones tore too easily. Yellow ones reeked of oil. Green ones burned his skin. But the black ones, those could buy him food. The dump was his classroom, his playground, his bed. He ate because of it. He survived because of it. But then the trucks stopped coming. The mountain of plastic began to shrink, and so did Madu's world. For 3 days, he sat on the same pile of waste, waiting for something to change, waiting for someone to notice. And someone did. A woman in a bright green government vest walked up and asked softly, "Why are you still here?" Madu whispered, "Because this is the only thing that fed me." That day, his life was pulled from the ashes. The woman took him to a pilot school, part of Burkina Faso's Green Transition Program. There, 10 children, all once scavengers of waste, sat at wooden desks. They no longer sorted plastic for scraps. Instead, they learned how to compost, how to mold cassava fiber into packaging, how to build something that healed the land instead of harming it. At first, Madu doubted himself. His hands were scarred, his mind filled with memories of scavenging. How could a dump boy create something fit for a supermarket? But within 6 months, he had designed a simple biodegradable pouch, strong enough to carry grain, safe enough to hold food, clean enough for dignity. When asked how it felt, Madu smiled shyly. "I used to search for what others threw away. Now I make what others need. It feels like I stopped breathing smoke." His story spread far beyond the schoolyard. Diaspora communities across the Atlantic heard it. In Atlanta, a pastor played Madu's story on a Sunday morning, declaring, "If the dump boy can rise, so can we." In Harlem, elders whispered prayers for a child they had never met. On social media, they called him the boy who turned waste into worth. And in that moment, Burkina Faso's pain began to look like possibility. Factories had closed, yes. Jobs had vanished, yes. Families had gone hungry, yes. But in the struggle, a new vision had been born. No longer were children condemned to the dump. No longer were workers chained to industries that poisoned their own homes. From Fanta's roasted corn wrapped in palm leaves, to Yakuba's cassava fiber machines, to Madu's biodegradable pouches, a new economy was rising, one woven from resilience, memory, and hope. But my brothers and sisters, let us not pretend the suffering vanished overnight. Some families still wept at empty tables. Some children still asked why their bread could not be carried home the old way. And some elders still doubted if dignity could truly fill a stomach. The grief was real. The cost was heavy. And yet, amid the sorrow, something deeper stirred, a shift of identity. For generations, Burkina Faso had been painted as a passive receiver of aid, a nation waiting for handouts. But now, through sacrifice, it had birthed a new story of innovation, of courage, of self-determination. Madu's hands, once cut by plastic waste, now built a future clean enough for children to touch. Yakuba's machine, once mocked, now produced thousands of bags a week. Fanta, once frozen in despair, now smiled as she tied each cob in palm leaves. This was not just survival. This was transformation. And so we must ask, was the cost too great? Were 10,000 jobs worth the clean breath of a nation? Was short-term pain worth long-term dignity? These are not questions for Burkina Faso alone. These are questions for all of us. Stay with me now, because while one small nation wrestled with its pain, the eyes of the world, and especially the voices of the African diaspora, began to respond. At first, the world scoffed. Analysts in Paris shook their heads. Economists in Washington declared the policy reckless. Headlines in London asked, "Can Burkina Faso survive its own boldness?" On talk shows, voices called it naive, a desperate gamble from a small landlocked nation. But then, something shifted. The skies over Ouagadougou cleared. Floodwaters drained faster through unclogged canals. Respiratory illnesses in clinics dropped by nearly 20%. And slowly, the doubters had to face what they could not deny. The air was cleaner, the land was healing, the people were adapting. International media began to change its tone. What once was written as a cautionary tale became a testimony of courage. Reports no longer framed Burkina Faso as the beggar of West Africa, but as a pioneer. Burkina Faso news began to circulate not as tragedy, but as triumph. Environmental agencies from neighboring nations sent delegations to study how the transition was being managed. Young leaders from Senegal, Ghana, and Nigeria quoted Traoré's words, "We cannot afford cheap things that cost us our lives." And across the ocean, in America, the story struck a deeper chord. In the pews of Black churches in Atlanta, Detroit, and Harlem, pastors told their congregations about a nation that had chosen dignity over convenience. Elders, who had marched in the civil rights era, nodded with tears in their eyes. "That is the Africa we dreamed of," they whispered. Diaspora communities saw in Burkina Faso's struggle a reflection of their own, the long fight for breath, for respect, for self-determination. Social media lit up with messages of solidarity. If Burkina Faso can ban plastic, surely America can reduce it. If they can choose health over profit, why can't we? But the greatest shift was not in politics or policy, it was in identity. For the first time in a generation, Burkina Faso was being talked about not as a victim of climate change, but as a leader in fighting it. And yet, my friends, the story was not finished. Because if one small nation could rise from the dust and dare to choose clean air, the question remained, who would follow? Would Africa stand united behind this bold step? Would America learn from a people it once overlooked? Would the world choose courage over comfort? Stay with me, for the answer lies not only in governments and leaders, but in the hands of farmers, vendors, mothers, and children. The rains returned slowly, almost shyly, as though testing whether the land was ready to forgive. And when they fell, something miraculous happened. Instead of flooding streets and drowning crops, the water soaked into soil that had been suffocated for years. Farmers stood in their fields, astonished as green shoots broke through the earth. One old farmer named Sif dropped to his knees when he saw the first sprout in Zinar. Tears carved lines down his weathered face. "The soil forgave us," he whispered. Not because it was just a plant, but because it was proof that the land had not given up on them. In schools, children who once drew smoke and trash now drew clouds and rain. One little girl explained her picture with a smile. Now the clouds can come down. They are not scared anymore. Her words spread across radio shows, repeated in markets, sung in homes. It became the anthem of a people rediscovering hope. Clinics reported fewer children gasping for air at night. Fishermen found streams less choked with waste. Market women tied vegetables with palm leaves proudly instead of apologetically. Grandmothers began teaching grandchildren the crafts of weaving and folding, once thought lost to time. The cost had been heavy. The pain was real. But the gain was undeniable. And beyond Burkina Faso, the ripple spread. Delegations from West African nations visited to learn. International organizations, once skeptical, now spoke of Burkina Faso news with respect. Diaspora communities in the United States embraced the story as proof that Africa could lead, not lag, in the fight for survival. But my family, the road does not end here. Because the question is no longer whether Burkina Faso can survive without plastic. It has already proven that it can. The question is whether the world has the courage to follow. Will other nations dare to put dignity above convenience? Will they risk short-term pain for long-term breath? Will they stand with those who chose to walk out of dust and into clean air? Burkina Faso has shown a glimpse of an Africa-clean future. But a glimpse is not enough. The journey must continue. Through innovation, through sacrifice, through the unyielding belief that our children deserve better than poison wrapped as progress. So I ask you now, if one small nation could rise from the dust, what excuse does the rest of the world have? Stay with me, because what comes next is not only about Burkina Faso, it is about all of us. My brothers, my sisters, we have walked through the dust of Ouagadougou. We have stood beside Fanta as she wept over her roasted corn. We have watched Yakuba hammer together a future from scraps. We have knelt with old Sif as the soil forgave him. And we have held our breath with young Madu, the dump boy who turned waste into worth. This is not simply Burkina Faso news. This is a testimony. A reminder that even the smallest nation, with the least resources, can rise and say, no more. No more wrapping our dignity in poison. No more selling tomorrow for a cheap convenience today. No more waiting for foreign applause before daring to breathe free. Yes, the pain was heavy. 10,000 jobs disappeared. Families trembled. Children cried. But out of the ashes, a new spirit was born. Innovation replaced dependence. Hope replaced despair. Dignity replaced shame. And in that transformation, the whole world caught a glimpse of what an Africa-clean future can look like. My family, this story does not end in Burkina Faso. It begins there. It begins with one broom, one decree, one act of courage. But it must continue in every market, every church, every community that believes freedom means more than comfort. So I ask you, will you stand with them? Will you speak their names, share their stories, carry their courage? Will you tell your children that Africa is not waiting for salvation, but building it with her own hands? If this story touched your spirit, write Amen in the comments. If you believe in a cleaner, stronger future, share this video with your family. And if you want to walk with us as we tell stories of resilience and hope, then subscribe. Not just with a click, but with conviction. Because the world must know, Burkina Faso news is no longer about begging, but about leading. Burkina Faso news is no longer about despair, but about dignity. This is the inheritance of a continent. This is the dream our ancestors carried across oceans. And now, my brothers and sisters, the choice is before us. Comfort or courage, plastic or breath, death or life. As for me, I choose life. I choose breath. I choose Africa.